Sometimes I'm convinced that the very best news sometimes when it comes to these Stronghold Digital Mining daily updates, the very best news is when there's no news. Let me explain. Today's Monday, September 25th, 2023. You know, on any given day, we could have a very significant problem at either Scrubgrass, Panther Creek, and or the associated data centers. That is probably the one thing that, so to speak, keeps me up at night. This idea that we'll have a significant outage of some kind, a problem, proverbial asteroid decides to fall out of the sky and land on one of our facilities, something like that. So the fact that we can have a weekend, we can have a day like today, right, where there's no negative news in that regard is a good thing. I thought a little bit about the many, many months, actually it's over a year now, that I've really been focusing on Stronghold Digital Mining. And when I really think about that period of time, thankfully, I really can't think of anything catastrophic. I can think of some news items that I think at first glance were maybe concerning, maybe not so much to me, but to the market. Like, for example, when we decided as a company to divest ourselves, so to speak, of a bunch of Bitcoin mining equipment late last year. I mean, for a lot of people, it's as if though the company had essentially declared themselves as going out of business. In a lot of corners, it was assumed, I think to some degree, quite fervently, that Stronghold would never rebuild its Bitcoin mining infrastructure. They would never get anywhere close to 4 exahash of Bitcoin mining capacity, and that, turning in all those Bitcoin mining machines, giving them back, really represented the very beginning of the end. So, for example, that's a good example of a news story that I think, the market really reacted quite negatively to. Now, prior to my involvement with the company, there had been some adverse news with regard to, the essentially the delivery of Bitcoin mining machines by a vendor. This would have been in very early 2022. Yeah, I mean, look, that's a tough break, a very tough break in a market that wasn't going to be very forgiving of a situation like that. But, when I really think about it, there too, the contract value, something like 85 to almost probably close to 90% of the contract value for that deal has been fulfilled. I mean, which is kind of remarkable. And by the way, that whole story about, Stronghold Digital Mining has given back thousands upon thousands of Bitcoin mining machines. What's going on here? Well, hey, about a year later, we actually reached 4 exahash of Bitcoin mining capacity. And now the real talk is, hey, what's going to be the next step? Because it looks as if though there's a very, very reasonable possibility we're going to be getting an announcement, as we've talked about before. Hey, where are we going to be, placing our roughly 25 megawatts of end-to-end data center infrastructure so as to grow our hash rate even further? So when we talk about news, sometimes I'm very grateful that there's not a lot to talk about, right, as it relates to bad news. Sometimes no news is better than hey, I've got some bad news to share, that sort of thing. And we've been very, very, I think, blessed and fortunate to have been all this time led by our Chief Executive Officer, Greg Beard. I think he has navigated this company superbly, and I really mean that. And, that's something else that I sometimes worry a bit about. Hey, is there a situation that, maybe Greg decides to move on from the company? And, where does that leave us? Now, thankfully, I think it was about maybe a month ago or so, give or take a little bit, the company re-entered into an agreement with Greg for his leadership to continue. Not to mention the fact, Greg himself owns a significant portion of this company. I mean, it's, arguably this is Greg's company. I mean, sure, we're all co-owners of the business, but I mean, he owns a significant piece of this business. And so I've always felt that his interests as chief executive officer, as a significant owner of the business, is very much aligned with those of us who are, shareholders and just co-owners of the business, right? So I am very grateful for the fact, going back to the original premise of what I started talking about, that, thankfully, there haven't really been that many situations, if any, really, that have been significantly bad for our business, right? In terms of like news items that, have really presented a bit of a bad break. Here's another like sort of like interesting example. Last summer, there was an electrical storm that affected the area around Panther Creek. And I'm paraphrasing here, but a tree limb fell on an electrical line. And so there was some issue with the power plant, right? The waste coal reclamation facility being able to generate electricity for about, I think it was like 10 days or so. Don't quote me on that, more or less. However, because we have the optionality, right, to import electricity from the grid, okay, sure, we weren't generating our own electricity, but we were still able to keep the data center running because of the redundancy of being able to pull, right, electricity in from the grid. And speaking of redundancies, both Panther Creek and Scrubgrass have a lot of redundancies at this point built in, so that if there were to be an equipment failure, something comes up, we as a company, right, Stronghold Digital Mining isn't caught flat-footed having to, wait potentially, weeks, right, for mission critical replacement parts to come in. So again, that's like really, really smart forward thinking. I'm convinced that at some point, it may not be anytime in the super immediate future, but that's okay. I have a very healthy time horizon as it relates to my involvement with Stronghold Digital Mining. This was never intended to be a get rich quick, flip the stock in 20 minutes kind of investment, or gamble, as I like to call it. This always had a longer term time horizon built into it. So I'm really looking forward to a couple of things. And first of all, I want to just share a little insight here. We never, at least as of yet, have gotten any sort of 8K, Form 8K, related to Stronghold Digital Mining's participation in the 25th annual H.C. Wainwright Investment Conference. So I'm not entirely sure what that might mean or not mean. Now, look, if it was a presentation that lacked any sort of accompanying materials, well, then I wouldn't necessarily expect there to be an 8K with materials that don't exist, right? Hey, if somebody's just kind of making a verbal presentation or, something like that, well, then there's not a whole lot to necessarily share. On the other hand, I do think to myself, is there a scenario in which there's flexibility, right, insofar as the filing deadlines and the filing rules that would strategically allow Stronghold Digital Mining to say, hey, you know what, we don't want to necessarily go public, right, which we'd effectively be doing through an 8K with what we presented, because the goal might be to have this all sort of come together with a fresh press release, a Form 8K, that kind of makes the big announcement regarding a very meaningful transaction. Okay, so I'll leave it to your imagination to discern what that might mean or not mean. But I have not forgotten their participation in the H.C. Wainwright Investment Conference. Now, something else that's coming up, pretty much we're practically at the end of the month of September here, the end of the third quarter. We already know that there's a very high likelihood we're going to hear something either this week, right, which would be basically at the very end here of Q3 2023, or sometime early in Q4. And by early, I mean, hey, maybe the first 45 days or so, maybe the first 30 days, wherein we find out a little bit more information about what's going to happen to the 25 megawatts of end-to-end data center capacity, or infrastructure that we own. I'm also expecting, as has now been the case for many, many months, that at some point in early October, we will get our Bitcoin mining update, right, where we're going to find out how much Bitcoin was produced during the month of September. So these are all things that are, kind of like, sort of like stage left, so to speak, right? And I think the spotlight is going to be on those items in the very near future. Our stock price, the last time I checked, it was holding up right above $4 a share. Again, I don't obsess over the stock price, not in this environment that's such a fraught environment. I was having a conversation earlier today, and the topic turned to the market generally, and I for one would not be surprised to see there be some significant turbulence in the broader market here in the United States of America, due to what I think I've described as like legislative dysfunction and some legislative challenges. There may be what is described as like a government shutdown, so to speak, that may commence, by the end of this week, absent there being some form of compromise within our legislative branch. Of course, just as a quick civics summary, in the United States of America, there are three branches of government: an executive branch, a legislative branch, and a judicial branch. So, and I share this because we seem to have quite a bit of interest from overseas, which is awesome. But basically, if the legislative branch is sort of like in a state of dysfunction, sometimes it can be very challenging for government as a whole to sort of operate efficiently. So be that as it may, there's a very real possibility that there will be a U.S. government, federal government shutdown. The only reason I mention that, nothing to do with politics, but in terms of the implication to the financial markets. Something else that's going to be coming up as well in the month of October, my understanding is that student loan repayments, again, this is a very U.S.-centric commentary I'm sharing here, but it has the potential to affect Stronghold Digital Mining stock price as well as the broader equity markets. Student loan repayments are due to begin again after having been paused during the COVID-19 pandemic. You have some of these structural macroeconomic factors that we have budget deficits in this country, I think approaching $2 trillion. Again, that's not a judgment. But if you're a doctor and you're looking at a patient's vital signs, if somebody's losing 2 liters of blood, I don't know, that doesn't sound very healthy, right? It doesn't sound like it's conducive to life, right? So there are some issues. Look, we've got to get through them. We're going to probably work through them in one form or another. But there are, I think, tremendous opportunities for significant market dislocations. And so, as I've alluded to before, buckle up, try to stay calm. Things might get extremely turbulent in the weeks and months ahead. But as I've always reminded myself, hey, all I can really focus on is that which, I have, I guess, a little bit more of a sense of, which is Stronghold Digital Mining, right? We as a company, the company can, move forward to do what is best for the company, which is what the company's doing. That's the best that could be hoped for. Look, you operate within a broader macroeconomic and a broader governmental environment. So that's, hey, it's a risk. It's also a benefit in certain regards. So you got to just do the best you can. And so with all of that said, hey, we got through the first day of this last week of the month of September, the last week in Q3 2023. So let's stay positive. Let's be great. Let's keep our eyes open for any press releases, any news releases in the coming days. I think there's a very reasonable chance we might be getting some interesting stuff. So until then, I will see you tomorrow.